The first snow of the season fell over the Wyoming frontier like a quiet warning, covering the frozen ground with a blanket of white that hid both beauty and danger. The small town of Red Creek had grown silent beneath the gray morning sky. Smoke curled from the chimneys of weathered wooden buildings while horses stamped their hooves outside the saloon, their breath rising in thick clouds. Most folks hurried indoors, eager to escape the bitter wind. Only one man rode toward town without slowing. His name was Ethan Cole, a cowboy known across 3 counties not because he was the fastest gun, but because he never ignored someone in need. He had spent years driving cattle, rescuing stranded travelers, and keeping peace wherever trouble followed him. The old leather coat hanging over his shoulders had seen storms, gunfights, and countless lonely nights beneath the stars. Yet Ethan carried himself with quiet strength, believing every person deserved one chance to be saved. As he reached the edge of town, something caught his attention. Fresh wagon tracks cut sharply through the snow, before disappearing toward an abandoned church near the frozen river. The tracks were uneven, as though the horses had been whipped hard. Ethan frowned. Few people traveled that road during winter, especially not before sunrise. His instincts, sharpened by years on the frontier, told him something was wrong. He guided his horse toward the church, the only sound the crunch of hooves against packed snow. The abandoned church stood lonely among leafless trees, its broken windows staring into the wilderness like empty eyes. Ethan climbed down from his horse and listened carefully. At first there was only silence. Then, carried by the wind, came a faint cry. It was not the cry of an animal. It was the desperate voice of a woman. "Please, somebody help us." Without hesitation, Ethan stepped toward the church, his boots sinking into the snow. The front doors were chained shut from the outside. That alone made his heart race. He walked around to a cracked side window and looked inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. 5 frightened women and 3 small children huddled together beneath torn blankets. Their faces were pale with fear and exhaustion. Standing over them were 4 armed outlaws dressed in heavy coats, laughing as though the suffering before them meant nothing. One outlaw kicked over a bucket of water while another counted money taken from stolen saddlebags. The leader, a scar-faced man named Burke Lawson, loaded his revolver with slow confidence. Ethan knew Burke by reputation. He robbed stagecoaches, burned ranches that refused to pay protection money, and disappeared before the law ever arrived. Men whispered his name around campfires, but rarely challenged him. Ethan had never expected to find him here. One little girl suddenly looked toward the broken window. Their eyes met. She couldn't have been older than 7. She raised a trembling hand toward Ethan before Burke grabbed her shoulder and shoved her backward. "Stay quiet," Burke barked. The little girl burst into tears. Ethan quietly stepped away from the window. 4 armed men against 1 cowboy wasn't good odds, but leaving wasn't an option. He untied the rifle from his saddle, checked the ammunition, then took a deep breath. Inside the church, Burke smiled cruelly. "By sunset we'll cross the state line. No sheriff will chase us through these mountains." One frightened woman gathered enough courage to speak. "Please, let the children go." Burke laughed. "They're worth money too." The words hit the room like ice. Several women began crying. Outside, Ethan circled toward the back entrance. It was blocked only by old wooden boards. Slowly he removed one board after another, careful not to make a sound. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. Then everything changed. A frightened little boy accidentally knocked over a lantern. It crashed against the floor. Glass shattered. Burke spun around instantly. "Who's back there?" Every outlaw reached for a weapon. Ethan knew surprise was gone. He kicked the remaining boards apart and stepped into the church, with his rifle aimed directly at Burke. "Nobody has to die today," Ethan said calmly. The church fell completely silent. Snow drifted through the broken doorway behind him. Burke slowly smiled. "Well, look what wandered in." The other outlaws spread into position. One pointed a shotgun toward the children. Another aimed at the women. Burke looked Ethan up and down. "One cowboy thinks he can stop 4 armed men?" Ethan never lowered his rifle. "I've faced worse." Burke chuckled. "I'll give you one chance. Drop your gun, and maybe I'll let you leave alive." Ethan glanced toward the terrified families. A young mother held her baby tightly against her chest. Tears streamed down her frozen cheeks. Their eyes met. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Save us, please." The words echoed through the abandoned church. Every outlaw laughed. Every frightened child watched Ethan. For one long moment no one moved. Then Ethan spoke 5 quiet words that silenced everyone. "As long as I breathe, nobody touches them." The laughter disappeared. Even Burke's smile faded. Something in Ethan's voice carried absolute certainty. He wasn't making a threat. He was making a promise. Outside, the winter wind roared across the empty valley as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. The silence inside the abandoned church lasted only a heartbeat before Burke's face twisted into a cruel grin. "Then you die first," he growled, raising his revolver. Before the outlaw could pull the trigger, Ethan dove behind an old wooden pew. The deafening crack of gunfire shattered the frozen era's bullets, splintered ancient timber, sending clouds of dust across the church. The terrified women screamed and threw themselves over the children, while little hands clung desperately to their mothers. Ethan leaned out just long enough to fire a single shot. His bullet struck the lantern hanging above Burke's head, exploding it into sparks and darkness. Thick smoke filled the room as the only light came from the snow-covered windows. Confused voices echoed everywhere. "Spread out," Burke shouted. "Find him." 2 outlaws rushed forward with rifles, believing Ethan was trapped. They never saw him slip around the side aisle. Years spent hunting through forests had taught Ethan how to move without making a sound. As one outlaw passed a broken pillar, Ethan stepped from the shadows and drove his shoulder into the man's chest. The outlaw crashed into a pew, dropping his rifle. Before the second outlaw could react, Ethan kicked the weapon across the floor and struck him with the butt of his rifle. Both men collapsed unconscious. Burke roared with anger. "Coward, fight like a man." Ethan answered calmly, "A real man doesn't hide behind women and children." Those words hit harder than any bullet. Even the frightened captives looked toward the cowboy with growing hope. Burke's face burned with rage. He grabbed a young mother by the arm and dragged her to her feet, pressing his revolver against her temple. Her baby cried helplessly as another woman caught the child before she fell. "Drop your rifle," Burke shouted, "or she dies." Ethan froze. He had faced impossible choices before, but never one like this. His eyes met the terrified mother's. She slowly shook her head, silently begging him not to surrender. Burke laughed. "You see, heroes always lose." Ethan slowly lowered his rifle until it nearly touched the floor. Burke smiled wider. Then, without warning, the church doors exploded inward. Sheriff Daniel Hayes burst inside with 3 deputies, guns drawn. "Drop your weapons," the sheriff yelled. Burke cursed under his breath. One of the outlaws fired wildly toward the entrance, forcing the deputies to take cover. The church erupted into chaos once again. Burke shoved the frightened woman toward Ethan and sprinted toward the back exit. Ethan caught the woman before she hit the floor and quickly handed her to another captive. "Stay down," he shouted. Then he chased Burke into the blinding snow. Outside, freezing wind whipped across the open field. Burke mounted his horse and fired twice over his shoulder. Ethan rolled behind a wagon as bullets struck frozen wood inches from his head. Sheriff Hayes joined him. "He's heading for the river." Ethan nodded. "If he reaches the canyon, we'll never find him." The 2 men mounted their horses and gave chase across the white prairie. Burke's horse thundered over the frozen landscape while snow sprayed behind every hoofbeat. The chase pushed through narrow pine forests, across icy hills, and toward the frozen Red Creek River. Burke looked back and saw Ethan gaining ground, desperate. He pulled another revolver and fired. One bullet struck Ethan's horse in the shoulder. The frightened animal stumbled, throwing Ethan hard into the snow. Sheriff Hayes continued chasing Burke while Ethan struggled to his feet. His shoulder burned from the fall, but he ignored the pain. Burke reached the frozen river first. He urged his horse onto the thick ice without slowing. Sheriff Hayes hesitated. "The ice won't hold," he shouted. Burke laughed as he rode farther across. Then a deep cracking sound echoed beneath the frozen surface. Thin lines spread across the ice like spiderwebs. Burke's smile disappeared. His horse panicked. The ice shattered beneath them. Horse and rider plunged into the freezing river. Burke screamed for help as icy waters swallowed him. Ethan rushed toward the riverbank despite the danger. Burke clawed desperately at broken ice. "Help me," he cried. Sheriff Hayes stared in disbelief. "After everything he's done?" Ethan grabbed a long tree branch and slid across the ice toward Burke. "Take it," he shouted. Burke reached with numb fingers and barely caught the branch. Ethan and the sheriff pulled with all their strength until Burke finally slid onto solid ground. Coughing and gasping for air, the outlaw looked up at Ethan, completely stunned. Why would you save me?" Ethan stood breathing heavily. "Because if I let you die, I'd become the kind of man you already are." Burke lowered his eyes, unable to answer. Back at the church, the women and children watched from the doorway as deputies returned with Burke in handcuffs. The young mother who had begged for help earlier walked toward Ethan with tears streaming down her face. Holding her baby close, she whispered, "You came back for us, just like you promised." Ethan smiled gently. No family should ever face evil alone. The little girl who had first seen him through the broken window ran forward and hugged him tightly around the waist. Even the hardened sheriff quietly removed his hat in respect. As the snow finally stopped falling and sunlight broke through the gray clouds, hope returned to Red Creek. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Burke hadn't acted alone. Somewhere beyond the mountains, someone far more dangerous was waiting. And this rescue was only the beginning. The morning after Burke Lawson's capture, Red Creek looked peaceful again, but Ethan Cole knew better. Evil rarely traveled alone. As the sheriff locked Burke inside the small jailhouse, the outlaw sat quietly on the wooden bench, his confidence gone. Yet every few minutes, he glanced toward the eastern hills through the tiny barred window. Ethan noticed it immediately. "You're waiting for someone," he said. Burke looked away without answering. Sheriff Hayes stepped closer. "Talk." Burke finally let out a slow breath. "It won't matter. By sundown ... He'll already be here." The sheriff frowned. "Who?" Burke swallowed hard. For the first time, fear replaced arrogance in his eyes. "Silas Crow." The name froze the room. Even the sheriff's face turned pale. Silas Crow was no ordinary outlaw. Stories claimed he commanded dozens of armed riders who robbed banks, burned ranches, and murdered anyone who stood against them. Entire towns had emptied after hearing his name. Burke lowered his head. "Everything I did for him." Ethan walked outside into the cold morning air. The rescued women were preparing to leave town in wagons provided by grateful ranchers. The young mother who had pleaded for help held her baby tightly as she approached Ethan. "I never even told you my name," she said softly. "I'm Grace, and this is my son, Noah." Ethan smiled warmly. "I'm glad you're both safe." Grace looked toward the distant mountains. "Will it ever truly be over?" Ethan followed her gaze. Dark clouds were gathering above the eastern ridge. "Not yet." Before another word could be spoken, the church bell rang wildly. A rider burst into town, his exhausted horse barely able to stand. "They're coming," he shouted. At least 30 riders. Panic swept through Red Creek. Shopkeepers slammed shutters closed. Families rushed indoors. Mothers grabbed children while ranchers loaded rifles. Sheriff Hayes climbed onto the boardwalk. "Everyone stay calm." But fear had already spread faster than his voice. Ethan looked toward the hills and saw them. Tiny black figures appeared against the snow-covered ridge. Within moments they became dozens of mounted outlaws riding together in perfect formation. At their front rode a tall man wearing a long black coat and a silver hat. Silas Crow. His horse stopped just outside town. The rest of his gang spread out behind him like wolves surrounding wounded prey. Silas smiled as though he had already won. "Bring me Burke," he called calmly, "and I might spare your town." No one moved. Sheriff Hayes stepped forward with rifle in hand. "You'll leave empty-handed." Silas laughed softly. "Then every man, woman, and child here dies." Silence followed. The townspeople looked at one another in terror. Ethan slowly walked past the sheriff until he stood alone in the middle of the snowy street. "You're looking for me too, aren't you?" Silas studied him carefully. "You're Ethan Cole." "I am. Burke told me about the cowboy who ruined everything. Ethan remained calm. If you're here for revenge, leave these people out of it. Silas smiled. You're willing to trade yourself? Ethan answered without hesitation. Yes. Gasps echoed behind him. Grace stepped forward immediately. No, she cried. You saved us. We can't let you do this. Ethan looked back with a reassuring smile. Sometimes protecting people means standing where danger falls first. Sheriff Hayes gripped his rifle tighter. I'm not letting you face them alone. Suddenly something unexpected happened. One rancher stepped beside Ethan, then another, soon nearly every man in Red Creek stood shoulder to shoulder behind him. Even older men who could barely lift rifles refused to step back. Grace looked at the other rescued women. Without speaking, they began carrying boxes of ammunition, blankets, and water to the defenders. Fear slowly transformed into courage. Silas watched the scene unfold with growing irritation. Touching, he muttered, but useless. He raised his hand. 30 rifles pointed toward the town. Ethan quietly removed his revolver and looked directly at Silas. You think strength comes from fear? He said loudly enough for everyone to hear. You're wrong. Strength comes from protecting people who can't protect themselves. Silas lowered his hand. For a brief moment, even he seemed affected by the cowboy's words. Then one of his own riders suddenly galloped forward. It was Burke. Somehow he had escaped during the confusion. He rode straight towards Silas, but stopped several yards away. I'm done, Burke shouted. Silas frowned. What? Burke climbed off his horse and threw his revolver into the snow. I spent my whole life following men like you. And for what? Fear blood. Ethan saved my life when I didn't deserve it. Silas's expression darkened. You're betraying me. Burke nodded. Yes. Without warning, Silas drew his pistol and aimed directly at Burke. Before he could fire, Ethan stepped between them. The gunshot echoed across the valley. Ethan staggered backward as the bullet grazed his shoulder. Sheriff Hayes and the townspeople opened fire into the air, forcing Silas and his gang to retreat. Realizing the town stood united, Silas turned his horse. This isn't over, he shouted before disappearing into the snowy hills with the remaining outlaws. Silence returned. Grace ran to Ethan's side. You're hurt, she cried. Ethan smiled despite the pain. Just a scratch. Burke dropped to his knees before Ethan. I don't deserve forgiveness. Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder. Maybe not, but everyone deserves a chance to become someone better. Tears filled Burke's eyes as deputies quietly placed him back into custody. This time, he didn't resist. Weeks later, spring finally arrived. Snow melted from the streets of Red Creek. Flowers bloomed across the prairie, and laughter returned to the town. Grace found work at the local schoolhouse, and little Noah grew stronger each day. Ethan repaired fences, helped neighbors rebuild damaged homes, and never asked for recognition. One afternoon, Grace found him watching the sunset outside the church where everything had begun. You changed this town, she said. Ethan smiled gently. No, the people changed themselves. They simply remembered that courage grows when good people stand together. Grace looked at him with gratitude. When I begged, save us, please, I thought no one would come. Ethan looked across the peaceful valley. As long as there are people willing to stand for what's right, hope will always find its way. The church bell rang softly across Red Creek as the sun dipped below the mountains, and for the first time in many years, the town slept without fear, knowing that true heroes are remembered not because they seek glory, but because they refuse to walk away when someone whispers, please ... Save us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring more emotional Western stories filled with courage, hope, and unforgettable characters.